So in our time post EOC test, I think probably any time we can spend on infectious diseases is probably well spent given the year we've all been through. First thing is to contrast with the kind of diseases we've already talked about, right? We've talked about genetic disorders and we've talked about cancer, which is kind of a specific oddball genetic disorder. Both of those involve DNA mutations, right? Cancer involves that one kind of mutation that means that the cell can't stop dividing. Other genetic disorders involve mutations that get passed down, right? Mutations that you only get by inheriting them. This is different. An infectious disease is, now we're into the kind of disease that can actually be transmitted from person to person other than inheritance. And so what we're going to do today by way of introduction is just to talk about 3 different ways we can classify, that we can differentiate infectious disease. We will start with a word that's really good to know, kind of a general term for something that causes an infectious disease, kind of a sciencey word that means anything that causes an infectious disease. Anybody know the word? It's not germ. Virus is a type of this word that I'm about to show you. There's 4 other kinds. Bacteria is another type of this word.
Like agents of disease, right?
Ooh, I like it. That's more than one word though. But yes, and this is a term that means an agent of disease. Pathogen. Such a good word. Path means harm or disease, and gen means to create. So we're going to classify by type of pathogen first. You already named 2 of them. The 2 most common, or at least most commonly talked about. Bacteria, which are in fact little living cells, little prokaryotes, very tiny percentage of the bacteria on Earth cause diseases, but some of them do. Give me an example. What's a disease that's caused by bacteria? Do you know? What's the last thing you got antibiotics for? That's how you tell. They only give you antibiotics if you have a bacterial infection. Cold and flu are both viral, so you shouldn't get antibiotics for those unless they suspect it might be bacterial. Say again? Strep is the big one. That's the one probably most of you have had at some point. That is the one you give penicillin or sometimes other stuff for because they've started getting resistant to penicillin. But absolutely, bacteria, strep throat is maybe the most common, at least around here. Viral, I already mentioned the flu. The common cold is viral. Let's see, any other viruses you can think of? Yeah. The V in COVID. Viruses are weird. They are kind of in a gray area between living and non-living. We will talk about their structure and cycles in a couple days. Then there's a couple other kingdoms of living things that can infect humans and other living things. Protists. Turns out these are some of the scary ones. Malaria, for example, is a little protist that dives into your red blood cells and hangs out there. The problem with protist-caused diseases, they're eukaryotes, right? They have a nucleus, they have all the cell parts that you have, which basically means they're hard to kill with targeted drugs without killing your cells, right? It's the same, a lot of the same working parts as your cells, so real hard to come up with a drug that kills them and not you. kind of like the problem cancer presents, right? Same with fungi, although antifungals are a little more effective. The kind of harmless, mostly harmless fungal infection you've probably had is athlete's foot. Known by other names on other parts of the body, like ringworm is also the same fungus that causes athlete's foot. It's not a worm. It's just it causes this little ring on your arm, a little rash on your arm that somebody decided looked like there was a worm there. I don't know. And then a really weird one that we'll need a whole story to figure out is prions, like the one that causes mad cow disease. More on that later. So 5 different kinds of pathogens. Questions about that? Are you guys sharing a highlighter?
Yeah.
Oh my Lord. Durable. Then there's routes of transmission. In other words, how does it get into people? What route does it take into the human body? And you know most of these. Give me some examples. What do you know about how pathogens get to you? Hmm?
The nose.
The nose. Like how? So, okay, I'll clarify. I don't necessarily mean entry point exactly. I mean, how is it transmitted? So, like, if it's the nose you're talking about, how to get in there? Good. Cough or sneeze droplets is, we often call that airborne, although there's some fine lines in there as to whether it's droplets or and how big the droplets are and how far they can go. But yes, what else?
If you touch like blood, isn't that one bad? Like somebody else?
With certain diseases, absolutely. Body fluids are an issue, right? Not just blood. Usually, these are also usually sexually transmitted diseases too. But yeah, we call those bloodborne. So bloodborne, airborne. By the way, quick public service announcement. It's been a weird year for all of us. I don't know your personal experiences, at least not all of them, with COVID and whatever. If at any point in this unit, things get to be too much for you, like we touch on something that's a little too personal for you or whatever, please don't be afraid to let me know in private, to excuse yourself if something's too much. I want to cover all the bases there. Like I get it if there's something that, there's some kind of trauma there or whatever. Okay. What's another way diseases get into people? I'll give you a hint. Malaria.
Insects or other animals?
Animals, yeah. Yeah, insects are the most common because they are the most common thing that bites humans, and that's a great way to spread disease, is to bite one human and then get some of that human onto another human by biting them too. Yeah, totally. When animals are involved in spreading diseases, we give them a certain particular name. We call them vectors. So these are vector-borne illnesses. You know what a vector is? Do you remember Despicable Me? That bad guy?
Mhm.
Doesn't he say, when they ask him about his name, he says something like, because a vector has both. Is it direction and magnitude? Yeah, it's a physics term, vector. A vector, when you draw one in physics, looks like this. And they usually write a force, like, 5 newtons of force. So force and magnitude, or direction and magnitude, that's what it is. And so, yeah, if you just picture like this being the little mosquito, and this being a person with malaria, and this being another person without malaria, you get the idea, right? It's a vector. It transfers the disease in a particular direction. Birds, rodents, dogs, all can serve as vectors. Okay, then water and food can spread disease. Those are waterborne and foodborne. And this is not just like, food poisoning, but like we could be talking about disease like cholera that spread via the water pumps, in England. I got that wrong. And finally, the other scary, and these are all scary, obviously, but like airborne is scary, just because everybody breathes. The other one that tends to be scary is contact, especially indirect contact. Like, okay, handshakes, hugs, kisses, that's direct contact. But indirect contact is scary. That's the idea that like, hey, you just sit at that desk, and then if you're sick, somebody who sits at that desk an hour later could get your disease from the tabletop, right? That's scary. There are diseases like that. Thank goodness. I mean, there were reports early on that, Corona can, COVID can survive on hard surfaces for like 3 to 5 days. And while that is true, the virus can be intact on there. Thank goodness it turned out that was not a way that it was commonly spread. Something about maybe the viral load that you don't get enough virus into you that way, but it appears that everybody can like stop disinfecting their groceries when they get home. So that's a good thing, because this could have been worse, right? Anyway, those are the routes, and there's one thing left, and that is how a disease is moving through a population, right? That's the other way to categorize the effect on a population. If there's a new word here, this is probably it: endemic. Endemic is not a noun. It's not, a disease is not an endemic. It's an adjective. A disease is endemic to a particular population. It means basically steadily present. It means about the same number of cases every year. It means characteristic of that area or population. Like malaria is endemic to Central Africa. Lyme disease is endemic to the northern and northeastern United States. The common cold is endemic to just about every human population on Earth. Then there's new stuff, right? Every so often, a new disease emerges that we've never seen. COVID-19 being the most recent. Those are scary because if we've never seen them before, we don't know how new they are to our immune systems. And it's the diseases that are novel or new to human immune systems that we haven't been evolving with and in response to for hundreds or thousands of years. Those are the ones that can cause pandemics. So whenever a flu picks up a new segment of DNA from, say, a different kind of flu, like a chicken flu or a pig flu, we get freaked out. Because human immune systems tend to overreact to novel viruses, and that's when the trouble comes. Been a lot of cool success stories about vaccination and public health and diseases that have been eradicated. But then humans tend to get a little cocky, and there's this possibility of what we call re-emerging diseases. Diseases we thought we got rid of, but if they get back into the population and we're not vaccinating for them anymore, that's a problem. Tuberculosis is a disease that happened around when I was in college. Several of my friends had to go on 6 months of antibiotics because they had the initial stages of tuberculosis because our test for it was bad. For years, they were doing tests that gave false negatives on tuberculosis. Smallpox with a question mark, probably the deadliest disease in history, smallpox. Very airborne, high fatality rate. Heroic efforts of doctors put the last case around 1977. It's gone, except that it's not completely gone because certain governments, ours included, keeps samples of it in cold storage, and we don't vaccinate for it anymore. So if it were to somehow reemerge, probably catastrophic. So, one more thing to worry about. The last two, and they have to do with our control of an outbreak. An epidemic is when basically there's a rapid uncontrolled increase, way more cases each week. We tend to go week by week in disease outbreaks. Once there's a number of new cases one week that is less than the number of new cases the previous week, we consider that a corner turned. Here in the movie we're going to watch, epidemiologists talk about turning the corner. Then there's epidemics that end up crossing continental borders, end up basically worldwide, and that's when we use the P word. One of the diseases that is a really good opportunity to study how epidemiologists work is a disease called Ebola. Raise your hand if you've heard of this disease. Not to be confused with E. coli, which is a bacterium. Ebola is a virus that causes what's called a hemorrhagic fever. Hemorrhage means to bleed, right? So this is a fever that actually causes people to bleed a lot. I have found it in the past to be a great way to get students' attention. First of all, I tend to have them read a passage from a book about Ebola that describes in great detail the late stages of Ebola, which involve basically the internal organs liquefying and the person bleeding out, like through every orifice. And it's very graphic. I don't know that this is the year for that. I think that's something I'm gonna say, if you're really interested, if that's stuff that you really, that really gets you, feel free to email me and I can send you a copy. But every once in a while, that's intense enough that a kid actually has a reaction and turns white or throws up or passes out or whatever. So it's happened a few times. So I'm not gonna do that this year. However, I do have a movie, much less graphic, believe it or not. It's always the book that gets them. This movie it's a documentary, and it was amazingly lucky. Basically, the crew of the PBS show Nova in 1995, there was an Ebola outbreak in a country called Zaire in Africa, and they happened to have a crew there. And so they basically set up camp and got incredible footage and interviews, and they tracked this outbreak all the way through. It's a great kind of look into the job of public health and epidemiology. So if you are okay with it, I would like to watch that movie. It seems like you are. If you have issues, if at any point, okay, so you're not going to see anyone bleeding out, all right? You will see people who have died from Ebola. Like you will see bodies. Most cases they're covered up. A couple of cases you'll see like a face, of someone who's died. If that's going to be too much for you and you know it, feel free to step out. Just make sure I see you leave, okay? If you start to feel weird during the movie, doesn't usually happen, but if you do, don't be a hero. First of all, stop watching, look away. And second of all, get somebody near you's attention and ask them to come quietly get me, and we will get you out of the room without further incident. I will give you something else to do. Good? Okay, of course I'm gonna ruin it with a worksheet, but it's a really easy worksheet, only one-sided. It'll be okay.
Over the worksheet.
Don't throw up on the worksheet.